Hello, welcome to this latest episode of the Scale Up Stateside with PGC. We're really excited to have you with us today, so thank you all for joining us and taking your lunchtime to hear about expanding internationally and how you can mitigate your risk. And we have the man for the job to talk everything risk and compliance today, because we're joined by Stephen Rookes from SRC Consultancy. In a minute, I'll let Stephen introduce himself, because he will do a much better job of introducing himself than I will. But just to introduce everybody, thank you all for joining us. Like we said, make sure to put any questions that you have as we go along in the comments. If we get a chance, we'll always answer them on the stream as well. So make sure you're dropping those comments in the chat. And hopefully, like I said, we'll get a chance to answer a few. If not, we'll make sure we come back to you afterwards as well, answering your questions. Our contact details will also be at the end too. So if there is anything that we don't get around to asking, to answering for you, then make sure you reach out to Stephen and myself. And what we're really going to do today is just focus on that key piece that we mentioned at the start. So expanding internationally obviously is fantastic. There's amazing opportunities that go with that. There are also risks that come with that as well, which is where Stephen comes in to tell us all about what you can do to basically make sure that you are protecting your business as best as possible to enter new markets, the US market as well. And in terms of the US market, by ways of introduction from PGC, that is what we do here. So PGC are a North American employer of record. If you aren't aware, we really specialize in helping businesses, primarily recruitment businesses, to expand into the US market and the Canadian markets to take care of all those complicated compliance items that we'll talk about today, and then really help you either build a contract book in America or build and scale your own internal workforce in America as well. So we're really looking forward to, like we said, having Stephen on, because with that amazing opportunity that comes in the US are amazing risks. And Stephen, over to yourself, because I'm sure you are going to, like you said, be able to introduce yourself a lot better than I will be able to.
Thank you very much, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honour to be able to join PGC on this. So NES Fircroft has a turnover in excess of $2 billion. So faced obviously a number of risks and compliance issues as part of its global expansion. I was responsible for negotiating the client contracts, making sure liabilities and indemnities were good, but also for all the legal risk and compliance issues around the globe, including obviously the US.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you. So for those who missed that, we're just at the start with that audio blip. Stephen was mentioned he was the global legal director at NES Faircroft. Most of us on the call will probably have heard of them. Also, when we were chatting offline as well, Stephen's had the experience of working both on the client side and the recruitment agency side of that as well. And so he's uniquely placed really to advise on, the best items and what each side of those negotiations are looking for. So like we said, really looking forward to hearing your experience, and primarily the 4 C's framework that you've generated as well, because they are, absolutely vital pillars that you mentioned for businesses when they are expanding into any market. Just before we get started, it'd be great to have a little thumbs up, use the little thumbs up emoji if you are working currently in other markets, so we understand how many people are already working internationally, not just the US, but any other markets as well, because a lot of what Stephen will share today will apply to any market, definitely, but obviously the US too. So without kind of any further ado, Stephen, you came up with the 4 C's framework. There's obviously a lot of reasons that went into that. And it'd be great maybe to just start by understanding a little bit more about how you came up with them, why you came up with them, and then we'll just go through what each of the C's is.
Absolutely, sure. So as for those people who have worked with me over those 16 years, they know that when we were dealing with complex problems, one of the things I always used to do was just jump up onto a whiteboard and start to map it out, summarize those issues to help us to get to the solution. So I like a good graphic. And when you think of the risk and compliance in international recruitment and expanding your business, there are so many risks and compliance issues to be dealt with that it can become overwhelming. So I sat down once I started up my consulting business and brainstormed them all, and just had this big blank sheet of A3 paper with all of the thoughts and ideas on the piece of paper. And then what I did over a period of time was obviously then condense that down and came up with 4 headings. The issue was then to come up with something that was memorable. And as you know, Will, I love to go out running. And that's when the ideas crystallized, and I came up with 4 headings that all began with a C, all right, in order to capture this. So for me, the 4C framework is an aide-memoire. It's a tool there to help focus our thought processes on the critical issues that impact on the business. And there will be some things that can be added. Some things may not be important to certain businesses, but it just provides that simple tool to say, capture and focus people's thought, so it's not quite so overwhelming, and we can deal with one at a time.
Fantastic. And if anyone who doesn't know Stephen or doesn't follow Stephen on LinkedIn, if you like trail running, there is no better follow on LinkedIn than Stephen. And so if you do have any related Snowdon trails that you want to go and hike or run, Stephen is definitely your man. So also message him about that, and also obviously international compliance as well. So obviously it's great to understand what, kind of the reasonings behind those 4 C's and those pillars. Maybe we should now just move into what the first one was, and what the first C that you came up with is.
So this first C is very much based upon the compliance, and to me it is the number one that's important. And I'm going to deal with the first 2 issues there a bit later on in the podcast when we talk about the main compliance considerations. But these are issues that are related to the way that you engage contractors or employees, as they would be called in the US, to do business activities for your end clients in a compliant manner. And that ranges from the way that you employ them, the way that you classify them, the visas to get them to work into foreign countries, tax that they need to pay, and then ultimately there is a big issue now related to data protection, particularly between the UK and the US. So again, I'll come back to talk a bit more about employment and classification shortly. If we move on to the second C, so for me, this is actually probably the most important C, because this is about the individuals that you place and how you look after them when they are on assignment. What happens if they fall ill, they get injured, or in those unfortunate circumstances, somebody does die while they're on an assignment? Have you got the right insurances in place? Have you tested those? There are scenarios that happen that when something does go wrong, it's going to be something that is very infrequent, may happen once or twice in your lifetime. But when it does, unfortunately, there's a breakdown in communications. And one of the things that I regularly did was we would run a scenario, we would test it to make sure that the communications between our teams and our external suppliers and medical providers worked. Then there's the onboarding, offboarding. The way that contractor is brought on and then subsequently offboarded will leave a relationship understanding with those contractors for you. And if they're offboarded early, then again, care needs to be taken to make sure that doesn't end up to be a dispute. And then travel, that's an important issue again, because you have a duty of care when moving individuals around the world to make sure that travel is safe, that you're putting them up in safe hotels, that the locations that they're going to are safe for them. And so there's a lot there that needs to be talked about and understood to make sure that works well for you. Move on to the third one. So this is a bit more boring. This is about the corporate setup, the way that your legal entity or your branch, or the way that you may use a third party, operate in the country, in the US or other overseas places. So which is the ideal setup? Is it an LLC? Is it an Inc? Is it a branch? All of those issues need to be dealt with, both from a legal and a tax perspective. In some jurisdictions, particularly in the Middle East and probably in Asia, you may need to have a third party who's a shareholder, a local national, all right? And that obviously adds massive complexities, particularly when they may have a 51% ownership or even more of that entity. How do you maintain control? How do you maintain control of your bank accounts, etc.? In some countries, it's necessary to have a trade license to be a recruitment business. Ultimate beneficial ownership is a question that will frequently come up with clients and banks and what have you. And then obviously, particularly in light of what happened in 2022 with Russia, sanctions is now a really critical issue, and it's very easy to fall foul of those if you do not keep on top of them. And the world is becoming increasingly complex, and we need to make sure that we don't fall foul of the sanctions. And then finally, it's great making all the profit, but if you get the cash trapped in that overseas country and can't get it back, into your home country to be able to use, then it's wasted money. All right. So we do need to cover that. And then the fourth one, and this is the one which sort of captures when things goes wrong. All right. So you may have done all those things well, but there is still a risk that things go wrong. So you may end up with a claim, and worst case, particularly in the US, is a lawsuit. So that is clients not paying your bills, or clients suing you for errors and omissions on behalf of a recruiter or for the contractor that you place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about contracts. As I indicated early on about the contractor, when you terminate them, poor performance, they may retaliate and want to bring a claim against you. Claims potentially from staff to do with discrimination and harassment, and then ultimately, have you got the right insurance in place to mitigate the risks associated with those claims? So that's the four categories. Will, any questions on those?
Yeah, I suppose looking at that, there's loads of areas of discussion. The thing that jumped out to me most of all is that there's actually quite a lot that links a lot of those C's, isn't there? Like you can imagine points, compliance and care. If you look at the headers within those pillars, they directly link to claims, and a lot of them, you look at the classification side of things, you look at onboarding and offboarding and terminations, and how easy it is to get that wrong, especially in a market where you are, not used to what the norms are in those areas. You don't know what you don't know, and so it's very easy to fall foul of things like that. And especially in like a litigious market like the US, for example, you can quite easily fall foul of claims into those things as well. So I suppose this is not a very fair question at all, because I'm sure all four of your babies. But is there any one of those C's out of those four that you think, if there's anything that you need to pay attention to the most, obviously conscious I don't want to steal any of your points from the next topic of conversation, which is the one that you think is the one that you is the gold standard that you can't fall foul of?
Care is number one, because you're dealing with human beings, and you've got to get that absolutely spot on. All right, because you're putting people's lives at risk if you don't.
So I suppose then moving on to what are your top three compliance considerations? So obviously they're the four pillars, but if there's somebody listening, what are the three big things that really go into expanding into an international market?
Okay, so focusing very much on the US, the first one is workers' classification. So in the US, and say similar principles will apply in other markets, but different language is used, etc. But you effectively have your PAYE employee, classified as a W-2, or your independent contractor, which could be a 1099 or a corp to corp. And it's fundamental to get this right. It is reported recently that Nike, a global brand that you would expect to get compliance absolutely right, is allegedly facing fines in excess of $500 million for misclassifying thousands of workers as independent contractors when the authorities suggest that they should have been employees. All right. So the golden rule is, by default, always go with PAYE employee, W-2. Only by exception, consider independent contractor, and if they meet the criteria. And your post last week on LinkedIn, Will, talked about the plumber. And I use a very similar one in all of my IR35 training, and independent contractor training that I did, which is the builder. Yeah. You have a desire. You want an extension in your house. You want it roughly this big. You want some door here. You want a window there. You want a sunlight at the top. And you want a few sockets along that wall. You then leave it to the builder. And the builder, as an independent consultant, does the detailed design, does the build for you. And if the electrician that was working on the project is not available, the builder will substitute. And you're not actually concerned as long as it's a competent individual. And that's the critical issue about the independent contractor. And I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think this is one of the key items that it's probably the biggest item that people get wrong when they enter the market, especially the US, is especially if you come from the UK, where every conversation that you have with a contractor is this role inside or outside of IR35? And that is the defining question of moving forwards in a lot of industries. It is a really hard switch to turn off in your head if you've come from the UK and you're going to the US, that this just is not as common an item as it is in the UK in terms of working outside of IR35. So as an independent contractor, if it is really common, it was almost be a red flag, like you mentioned, Stephen. You've got, that you can't possibly have. I actually saw somebody explain it really well. He said, if you had an IT consultant come in and act like a plumber or act like a builder, the hiring manager would get rid of them straight away because they turn up at 10 a.m. They just do whatever. You've got no idea what they're doing. They bring in their own laptop with all sorts of whatever on it. You don't know what software they're using, whatever. They're just leaving. They've got no one's telling them what to do or how to do it or anything like that. It doesn't really marry itself up in some aspects to the same what you would expect of a true kind of contract placement to kind of look like and actually behave like. And so if you look like an employee and you behave like an employee, the key is what you mentioned. It's W-2 first. Prove to me that you're an independent contractor, and you can do assessments, you can use tools, you can go about that. But it's vital to get it right, because you look at the figures that you just mentioned there, $500 million for Nike, and that's just, the fines. That's not even
that's the tip of the iceberg for them.
And the legal costs on top are even almost match a lot of those penalties that come in. You've got backdated benefits. The consequences of getting that one wrong just can't be understated or overstated enough. It is the one you have to get right, definitely. Absolutely. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about it.
So the next one is regulatory compliance. All right. And in the US, the key piece of legislation that we need to be aware of there is what's called the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FSLA. And there are two key classifications under that one for W-2 employees. Non-exempt, which means that the FSLA applies, or exempt, which means FSLA does not apply. And depending on the individual's job duties, the salaries, and many other factors, you may be able to consider somebody as exempt, and therefore you don't need to pay them overtime. Again, there are big risks associated with this. So by default, always classify somebody as non-exempt and pay overtime, but only by exception. And again, having considered all the factors, and they are extensive and open to interpretation, would you consider somebody to be exempt? But if you put somebody exempt, be aware there's a possibility that when they finish their assignment, they're going to challenge it. And then you've got, again, legal costs to defend an overtime claim.
Yeah, definitely. And for contractors that are ran through PGC or an employer record, that is the responsibility, or should be the responsibility, of the employer record that you partner with. So they will go through that process for you. But that is a key thing to understand, even if that is not necessarily part of your responsibility of classification, is understanding that, because overtime, again, is a massive piece in the US. The clients don't have discretion over that. They can't choose whether or not they pay it. They can't choose what rate they pay it at. They can't choose to not pay it. It's law that, for the most part, generalizing, anybody who works for more than 40 hours a week is entitled to 1.5 times their rate of pay. And that is for people who are non-exempt. And like Stephen said, you are classed as non-exempt unless you can be proven to be exempt according to the FLSA. So again, you always err on the side of caution and prove that you can go the other way. And then you're going to be, the right side of the line more times than not, which is the key, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And then the third main consideration is the client contracts. So contracts in the US tend to be far more onerous than they are in the UK. They're often written as consultancy contracts or engineering contracts, which is not the case in the UK so much. So you need to assess very carefully the liabilities and your risk exposure, and to make sure you've got the right insurance. So PL, or public liability we call it in the UK, is called general liability in the US, and the professional indemnity is called errors and omissions in the US. Because when something goes wrong on site, there is, again, likelihood of lawsuits, and you're going to get dragged in because your employee or independent contractor was on the site, and therefore lawsuits just bring everybody in the US. So, and again, making sure that you don't accept the liability for the contractor. The US clients tend to try and transfer that risk to you. And that's obviously part of the role that I was playing with my US team to minimize that exposure that we had.
Yeah, I really like what you said when we were chatting last week, Stephen, in terms of there are risks that you have to take on, and that's part of doing business. But it's understanding what they are and looking at that and going, okay, we're happy with the level of exposure that kind of exposes us to, because business is essentially a divvying up of risk. That's all contracts are, aren't they? So yeah, really, really like that. Definitely. So that's kind of the key ones where businesses go wrong. What are your top tips to kind of make sure that you would advise somebody looking at the US market and thinking, fantastic, you see the opportunity there, absolutely amazing. I see the margins, I see the profitability, I see the size of the market and how much bigger we can scale it over there. What are your 4 top tips or whatever they might be? What are your top tips of saying to someone, right, these are things you must or mustn't do?
Okay. So I have 4 that I've sort of condensed it down to. So the first one is engage a good service provider, somebody like PGC to manage the compliance. Because as we've sort of talked about today, it is very comprehensive. It is complex, especially if you're new into the US market. To look after the employment contracts, look after payroll, visas, etc. All right. So that's my number 1. My number 2 is do some research, do a bit more research, and do a heck of a lot more research, because you can never do enough when you're trying to enter a new international market. How to do business, what are the market opportunities? Really get under the gloss of the big margins out there, the ability, there's a big market, there's limited competition, all right? How are you going to get your niche and really understand that so that you know that the investment that you're going to be making into any international market is going to reap the reward for you? Thirdly, not surprisingly, check your client contracts. It is so very easy that when you're new into a market, just to sign the new contracts, you've got an ambitious business plan to hit and lots of pressure because lots of money has been invested in that opportunity to bring you overseas. But be careful of vanity and kidding yourselves that this is actually good business, because it could come back and you may live to regret it when it bites you in the place you don't want to be bitten in. And there are claims and there are lawsuits. So the client contracts do need to be carefully examined to ensure that actually you are setting yourself up on the road of success for the future. And my 4th one, not surprisingly, is engaging a credible business advisor, somebody that can help you understand the risk, who's got the T-shirt, got the battle scars, and knows, can guide you through some of these complexities that we've talked about today.
Absolutely. So I think we completely mirror on so many aspects of what you've highlighted, Stephen, in terms of being the keys to look out for. And one of the things that I say to all of the clients that I speak with is, whatever area or kind of whatever query that you have pop up, you can't speak to a non-US professional or a non-US experienced professional. You have to speak with someone who understands that, has done it, has got the badges, has got the stripes, has been through those kind of queries that pop up and knows what actually is behind that query, because often that is really what the key thing is going on. Yeah. And I've used it loads of times today. I use it all the time. You don't know what you don't know. That is not your fault. How are you supposed to know what you don't know? Yeah. But there are people out there that do, and their job is to make sure you are protected so you can be as successful as possible. So businesses like Stephen, businesses like PGC, like attorneys, like accountants, you want to speak to people who are understanding of that, not people that kind of say, well, I'll have a look at it for you. Yeah, it's not really my area of expertise, but I can do it on the cheap for you. You will pay for that later.
Absolutely.
There are far more risks that come with that than that initial kind of cost saving comes along. And just to echo the key piece that you mentioned, research, that is one of the biggest ways that we see people fall down early, is you treat the US like it's one place. Even you treat a state like it's one place. There are so many complexities that come with those markets, that the sizes of them, the people, the culture, the tax, the legislation, the industries within those markets. It like you said, you can't do enough research. So if you're at that early on stage of expansion, you're at the perfect time to just research. Never stop researching. You should always have people dedicated to that, looking into those markets, looking into all of the drivers behind that as well. Definitely, and be as niche and as focused as you can be. And also, just from a pure business development point of view, the better you understand your market, the more credible you come across to your clients, and the more you differentiate yourselves from other people in your same market as well. Because it isn't as saturated as the UK, but there are people out there doing US recruitment. And so you do need to, it's not just go out there, throw a wide net and see what comes in. If you want to succeed, you need to go small to go big. Know what you're best at and focus down on that as well. So, Stephen, really appreciate all your advice today, all your tips. Fantastic. Where can people find you at? So say, for example, we've got a client, they are really excited about the US. They may even be in the US already or in other markets, and maybe they've got themselves in a bit of trouble. Hopefully they haven't, and they just wanted to stop that happening. Where can people find you, and how can you assist them?
Okay, so the best place probably is LinkedIn, which is I'm fairly active now on LinkedIn, and I normally do a sort of a post on a Friday that sort of picks up a business issue or a personal issue. So you should find that, and there's the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen for my LinkedIn profile, or you can email me directly at Stephen at srcconsultancy.co.uk, or you can visit my website, and that's the QR code on the left-hand side, and there is a contact form there, and obviously that website does pick out the key services that are offered by SRC. Yeah, many opportunities to connect with me.
Can't recommend highly enough following Stephen just for that. That Friday post is fantastic. In any market, there are so many kind of key and real, learning points that you can pick out from that big post that he does on a Friday. So make sure to give Stephen a follow. Make sure to reach out to Stephen, myself, or any of the team at PGC if you've got any questions about the US market at all, or there's any items that we've discussed today that you wanted to talk about further and explore what that looks like for your business. I can't believe I've actually ran this to time.
Doing well.
I think it must be Maria's fault, because every time it's me and Maria, it's like 75 minutes over, because we spend the whole time talking about sandwiches or the weather. So we haven't done any of that. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And Stephen, thank you for all your learnings, for sharing your experience. I've learned a lot. I know everybody else watching will have learned a lot as well. And make sure you tune in next time for the next episode of the Scale Up Stateside.